Topic 3, some ways to engage with these topics that center what can be done while avoiding tokenism or the paralysis and burnout commonly encountered by those working towards systemic change. Lots of people will accept a nudge. It feels good and it looks good for business to do good things, to be seen as just a bit greener or just a bit more progressive. If a small shift is the goal, fairly wide adoption by existing systems is reasonably feasible. Purchasing from BIPOC-owned businesses, donating some soil or space to community gardens, planting a few trees in an inner city schoolyard, adding an Indigenous-themed garden to a park. It feels good, has nice PR spin, and doesn't require systemic change. It's a lot like planting Echinacea, Rudbeckia, Liatris, and Serviceberry to improve the ecological capacity of a landscape. Native plants that don't require a shift in landscape planning, construction, or maintenance practices, just a shift in specifications. Nudges can help with the right now work, the immediate access to spaces, activities, and resources that will help to make a difference and make life better for people stuck within the system. Nudges can also be a starting point for those who are concerned with existing structures and are looking for a way to engage with starting to create change. And they can come together quickly, they can be completed in a very real and visible way, and they leave everyone involved feeling a bit more engaged and a bit less helpless in the face of overwhelming challenges. Systemic shifts follow a slightly different arc, although nudges can help plant the seeds for them. They build slowly and they almost always come from below rather than down from above. Activities that support systemic change may or may not engage directly with the people and businesses who are currently occupying the existing horticultural space. In a reimagined future, the people currently holding a space are not necessarily the ones that will be occupying it in that future. The space itself may change so much that it becomes a different space altogether. While engaging everyone in the change process can be worthwhile, convincing people occupying a space to change may not be the only option or even the most effective one at times. To borrow a line from Upton Sinclair, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. The reality that some people who are benefiting from current inequities will lose some of those benefits if the inequities are corrected, and unless they are prepared to recognize the gains that also come from more equitable communities, will not want the existing situation to change. There's also the discomfort of the unfamiliar and fear skills that have been long practiced been becoming less valuable or even reframed as reinforcing patterns harmful to the health of a changing system. To those in this position, change can feel like an attack, so resistance is to be expected. Whenever possible, just go around those who are heavily committed to defending the status quo. It isn't all that unusual for them to hurry to catch up if they realize that you're getting too far ahead of them anyway. And if going around isn't an option, take the time to build up some group momentum and some support first. Nothing's entirely immovable, but the more irresistible the force that can be brought to bear, the less likely for momentum to be shattered in the encounter. Building up the alternative system will also do a lot to shift existing structures and tends to have a more lasting effect while leading to fewer concussions from banging your heads against walls or glass ceilings. Finding the balance in all of this between we created the current system, it's up to us to fix it, which is true, and nothing about us without us, which is also critical. The root causes of inequities are not in the communities and cultures that have been pushed to the margins. They are in the cultures that the pushing is coming from. It's a lot like natural system restoration. Mostly, we just need to stop harming systems for them to recover. Stop plowing them, stop spraying them, stop pouring salt into them off of road runoff. It's amazing how fast systems will start to recover. Although the process isn't always as fast as we would like it in our speed-addicted world. While it goes against a lot of what we've been socialized to do start with the internal conversations and the emotional labor. Don't ask those who have been hurt to support us through the emotional turmoil of unpacking our relationship with and how we have unwittingly benefited from the system that is causing the harm. When working to overcome a lack of diversity in a space, do hire speakers and educators. Don't tack equity work onto someone's existing full-time job just because they're a member of a marginalized group. And if you're working on any of this as an individual, read books by BIPOC authors, watch videos, organize a peer group around identifying and discussing what's happening within our spheres and possibilities for change. Start a book club to read, process, and discuss topics and our reactions to them. That link that you can see at the bottom of the slide is to a CBC radio show. It was a doc project that aired in March about a white discussion group that found a home at a Black community association, and they're working together on some of this. And it was a really good sort of hour-long radio segment. Another important point is relationship and then action. It's a conversation that is taking place in more and more social change circles as the superhero and white savior and the volunteerist roles are meeting with the growing pushback. Relationship is critical, but for those of us who have gone through life learning to get by in a culture that places individual and competition before community, some work on learning how to be in community and places to practice those skills are important before trying them out in communities that already have enough to do and don't need the extra work of decolonizing us. As I mentioned earlier, these aren't BIPOC issues. They are issues of horticulture, landholders, and cultural norms. Dismantling colonial culture isn't something that I'm convinced is something that I'm convinced will need a lot of guidance for, especially from those who have been most directly harmed. But the actual work of dismantling is up to us. Colonialism is mostly about those of us from colonial backgrounds. If we went away, systems and cultures would begin to recover instead of just being pushed further and further towards assimilation or annihilation. That's why calls for decolonization do meet with such a visceral reaction. They are at the root a demand for the removal of a system that many of us are embedded in, but we don't really have anywhere and a way to go to. So to decolonize, we need to do the work of relearning how to be in reciprocal relationship. And that's a lot of work, but so is functioning as a visible or cultural minority in the existing system. So it's only fair that the workload be spread around a lot more evenly. And the great thing about this work is that if we stick to it, it gets easier and it makes life easier for those who have been the most harmed. So everybody benefits when we do this work. Once moving along the path, a lot of things that were normal or barely noticed, and because of that acceptable, will become unacceptable and impossible to ignore. This is usually the point when longtime friends decide they really don't want to hang out with us anymore because we're always going on about colonialism and genocide and ecosystem collapse. It can get a bit annoying to be around. It also gets hard to be around people who don't think about and care about these things. That is when cultivating community does become critical, and I will talk a lot more about cultivating community in April. One of the things we can do is narrative changes or restorying horticulture. And one of the ways I'm actually sort of working on that in my own head, because that's where a lot of this starts. Is it starts in how we think. And one way I've been working on practicing shifting my thinking is practicing different ways of speaking and writing. And I'm specifically working on some shifts in the language. I'm replacing the word property with land when I'm talking about land. And if you start to listen, we refer to land as property far more often than we actually call it land in general conversation. Addressing plants by name or as they rather than it. Replacing maintenance practices with land care practices, because maintenance is about forcing things into an unnatural static state as opposed to caring for them as they mature. I describe the gifts, the capacities, the roles, and the purposes of plants and other beings rather than uses. I don't call land vacant just because it doesn't include humans or human-built structures. I'm also working on talking about gardens as being a part of nature as opposed to apart from nature. I'm celebrating plants that have gone to seed. So when I post photo collections of a species of plant, I also, if I have gotten the photos at the right time, share the photos of them in seed stage, because that's also glorious. I gather fruits and vegetables and seeds rather than obtain a yield from the plants. I replace descriptions like aggressive with abundant, adventurous, and adaptive for plants. I'm also working on replacing the word development with displacement and or replacement when talking about human activities relating to land and ecosystems. We're also working on replacing the term developing in expression like developing countries or economies with recovering, since almost every country that the term developing is applied to has actually had their wealth stripped and exported to the countries we call developed. But I'm starting to wonder if we should start calling these countries engorged, because they're just stuff full of things that came from elsewhere. Another story is, as I mentioned earlier, in horticulture, we modify spaces to make people feel good. This is the core of what we do. So we can change the narrative from one based on domination and exploitation of land and plants and people to one of care of land and plants and people and community. This is a narrative that many people do want to be involved in. It feels good. You start to get engaged in it. It really feels good. So when you're ready to go from the internal work to the external work, and this is not a clean progression, this is a back and forth and zig and zag, and activities work on each other, and you could even consider spiraling out or spiraling in, depending on which way you want to look at it. But what it isn't is a straight line. It could be many things, but it's not a straight line. But when you're ready for some external work as opposed to the more internal work, this is an example of some possible actions. So this is sort of a theoretical collection of ideas that is inspired somewhat by an event that was described in a talk that I attended this winter, which is available at that link you can see there. So a two-spirit Indigenous land reclamation garden was planted in a city park, and municipal staff mowed it. Also, Isaac Crosby in his talk in November did describe some similar challenges while doing his work at the Evergreen Brickworks. And so the why did it get mowed? Because the plantings weren't neat, tidy, and approved. The deeper issue would be that it didn't conform with standards of sort of the colonial horticultural order. And so it directly challenged cultural norms about who had the right to make decisions about that land that was within an urban park. So what are the things that we could do to offer support in situations like this? And again, this is theoretical, and do not do any of this without the permission and engagement of the people leading the project. So immediate needs, support in protecting the gardens. Do people need to be there at all daylight hours to ensure that they don't get mowed again? Also resources for replanting the gardens. Can you help supply that? Short-term needs, communication and education resources for municipal staff and managers, for local residents on reconciliation policies and Indigenous land rights, and even inviting media engagement if the leaders of the project feel it would be safe and appropriate. In the medium term, offer to do the work of teaching the local community about parks, how their care and maintenance and what activities are acceptable within them have been defined by a very narrow set of colonial standards, and how breaking down these ideas is an important step in reconciliation. Long-term needs would include reevaluation of the role of public green spaces, centering the needs of people who have been pushed to the margins, especially in urban settings. Aaliyah talked about the importance of this in her session in February. We aren't qualified, though, to teach about cultures not our own, but there's a lot about cultures that are our own that will need to be explored and considered. So those things I talked about teaching the community about and engaging municipal staff, that's actually all things about colonial culture. And we can delve into that. You can further engage people by exploring our own stories and our own roots, who our own seed relatives are that we have given up on our way to being at this point in time and place. We can start practices of recovering and caring for our stories and caring for our plants so that we can better see the origins and patterns behind today's normal. How did we shift from when we cared for seeds to when we just demand that they do certain things for us now? There's a process that happened there. There's a story to follow back. And recovering our land relationships isn't something that those of us from settler or immigrant backgrounds need to be excluded from. By inviting people into this journey, it does remove the scary and starts the process of unpacking our own trauma reactions around land relationships and the severing of those relationships. All of us who have come from settler or immigrant backgrounds have severed land relationships in our history, and the trauma behaviors from that are embedded in our behaviors and as part of our culture. We all have things to unpack, and if we do our own unpacking, there might be a lot less backlash when other groups try to do their unpacking. And sometimes, in addition to these big support things and these big idea things, sometimes coming up with simple things can also help. Sometimes we need a sign. What if you just ideas. Develop signs for gardens being created by the community on public lands. If there's a land reclamation project going on or some other project that is community-led and about some form of sovereignty, you could stick a sign in that garden to say, to parks maintenance staff, this is a community or Indigenous gardening project, and dealing with the politics of cutting it down is above your pay grade. Please either just leave it be or have someone contact us before removing or damaging any of these plant relatives. Municipal staff could also take like a leadership role from the municipal side. Have a sign you can put in a garden. This garden isn't in our records. Please give our community garden staff a call at to discuss and update to our records and maintenance plans. You can invite engagement. There are opportunities for doing that. And the invitation at this point in time probably should be coming from the municipal side and from the government side, as opposed to having to beg for permission from the other side, because that's a pretty touchy subject for a lot of Indigenous communities. Other similar supportive activities. If there's any grant writers watching this or communication specialists, what about getting a grant to develop an education package for any municipalities around diversifying community engagement in community-owned landscapes as part of Canada's reconciliation process? We frequently talk about the importance of seeking Indigenous wisdom and knowledge if we're to survive climate catastrophe and lots of other things. Can really start by returning some of the urban landscape to Indigenous stewardship, not just for ecological restoration, but actually for community practice and growing, because in the indigenous cultures I've had the good fortune of encountering, these are not separate. Ecological restoration, community restoration, then there's not one without the other. So you can't just go, oh, well, the indigenous people can help us exclude everyone else. That's not how it works. Also, when you're trying to cultivate sort of initial connections around topics or issues, gathering around food works. Gathering to share food is nearly universal. It's a nearly universal means of connecting and nurturing the relationships, and can be a good way of breaking down barriers. Try partnering with a community group as a fundraiser if you don't have any connections to start from. And then when you're there, have human, not other, conversations over the meal. Be curious and interested. Don't try to prove wokeness or knowledge, or spend the entire time on the horrible, traumatic things that you've heard about in an attempt to bond with those from the community you're hoping to form a relationship with. Start with just simple things. What fills your time? Talk to people, ask them about who they are, not just what they are or what they have to survive. You can talk about the food as a starting point. What have you tried so far? Any favorites? And there's always room. You can even talk about the event. There's always room for improvement in events like these. Is there anything you would suggest we do differently next time? Ask for feedback, open up to it. Another thing I've done in situations where I'm trying to ensure that it's clear that I will take feedback, and I also know that I'm not there yet. I will do my best, but I'll totally screw up. Please feel welcome to let me know if I'm suffering from foot and mouth disease. And then listen without defending if somebody takes you up on your offer. It isn't easy just to listen when somebody's telling you, no, that was wrong. But there is some good advice I've received, is that to engage in social, race, and equity issues requires a combination of a thick skin and a sense of humor. Now, I actively work on balancing those with respect to my own capacities and boundaries. I know my skin is only so thick. I will not lose my temper or get defensive in the moment, but I know it will take time for me to process all my reactions, and that's on me and on my time. And I need to pay attention to my need for that, because I am also on a journey. As you're working through these, do invite peers to be part of the solution. Again, the sense of not being able to do anything about big challenges is something that keeps people from engaging in big challenges. But these problems that I'm talking about, they are systemic. We are inside the system. So let's work on identifying the points that we can interrupt the patterns or remove barriers that are excluding people. Invite engagement in the solutions, and that will help get people past that, I don't want to deal with this because there's nothing I can do about it. Also, there are a lot of people, marginalized communities, who are working on food security, urban growing, etc. As gardeners and landscapers, we are in almost all of the urban green spaces one way or another. Can we identify some areas for people to create their gardens and grow their food? Are there resources that can be made available? Even things like a few feet of a greenhouse bench might be all that somebody needs to plant the seeds for their new urban farm business. If you have space, share it. Offer the space to someone who wants to grow food for themselves, their community, or as a livelihood. You can join or create a local food program like Liberating Lawns, which is something that Cheyenne runs through Sundance Harvest, and you can find information about it on her website or in the January session for the series, which she was the speaker for. Grow a garden, rewild the space, and support a local business all at once. You can do things like plant a native garden that also is a nursery bed and a seed patch for an independent plant grower. You can come up with creative solutions. Also, can you do straightforward things. Can you offer skills, space, or resources to high schools that would like to have a gardening program, but are missing critical pieces, especially schools in communities that already are dealing with limited resources? Growing in the Margins is getting ready to go online. There will be marginalized youth looking for spaces and supplies for growing all across Canada in the next year or two, if not sooner. And Growing in the Margins is another project that Cheyenne started, and you can find information about that on her website. When working on this, it's something that we all need a little bit of support with. So do practice, but also invite people into your circle of practice. When working on change, it's so much easier to be persistent when we have a community that is working with us. When trying to move from theoretical to practical, having a space to practice different patterns, it's critical. Learning new cultural and livelihood patterns and narratives, it's a lot like learning a new language. It really needs the support of others who are also on the same journey, or even better, who are further along on the journey than you. In social media, on garden tours and articles and blogs or presentations, extend invitations to notice and explore connections. What is perceived as intimidating or chaos becomes intricate and fascinating if we slow down and we're introduced. So bringing back that wonder of the new to us that we all had when we were young is something that can help break down some of our fear reactions when encountering that which is unfamiliar.